So, as I probably don't have to tell you, firms, producers use their cost as metrics. What I mean by this is that they use their costs as decision-making apparatuses. What I mean by that is that they look at their costs and they use those costs as a specific determination of what decisions they should make in the short run. But they don't simply look at total cost. They look at costs from a little bit more of a specific um, position. And so, two of the more important types of costs that we're going to discuss in the course is average total cost and then average variable cost. Average total cost is simply total cost divided by Q. So as you can see here, we take that total cost function, we divide it by Q, we do some simplification here. But the main point here is just that average total cost tells us basically on a per unit basis how much is each unit of our product costing us as sort of a piece of our total cost story. Now, average total cost is a very important cost metric that nearly every company knows very well and uses in their decision-making process. But what we'll find out is that average total cost can be a bit of a mirage in a sense in terms of business decision making, in that it is a very important metric for us to understand, but ultimately it doesn't actually make a decision for us. We'll actually look at other costs, and we will use those as kind of those decision making pieces. And average total cost will really become a way for us to measure cost, to actually measure how much cost is accruing to a firm given a particular amount of production. And that sort of same story goes with average variable cost. Average variable cost is just our variable cost divided by quantity, and it just tells us kind of relative to our total cost of production, again, that just variable cost piece, how much is each unit costing us roughly. It's not a super, maybe sort of important or specific cost, maybe not as important as total cost, average total cost rather, but it's still going to be something that we're going to need in our analysis because it becomes, again, that decision making component. And what we're going to find out is that the average total cost and average variable cost curves, while not necessarily being the main decision making components of profit maximizing decisions, are themselves very important curves because they do tell us something about the relative profitability of a firm, or whether the firm should even stay in business. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, is this concept called marginal cost. Now, marginal cost, as we'll find out, is actually going to be that decision-making piece. Spoiler alert, it actually ends up being the firm's supply curve, but we'll get to that here in just a moment. The marginal cost curve is a little bit ambiguous at first. Students have a hard time kind of really understanding what's going on. So let's kind of take a step back and let's go back to the average total cost and average variable cost curves. And let's look at this graph over here to the right. So we can see the average total cost curve kind of starts out flat, might even decrease here a little bit at the beginning, and then eventually rises. The same with average variable cost. And then we can see that marginal cost kind of does the same thing and then rises. Now, average total cost, as quantity rises, we can see stays kind of flat for a bit and then rises. What that tells us is that when we produce very little of our product, our costs are pretty contained. And so the curve itself is relatively flat, or at least it could even be falling. And we'll see that in a curve here in just a moment. And then once it gets past marginal cost, we see that it rises and really kind of starts rising precipitously. And again, this goes back to this concept of diminishing marginal returns. I cannot simply produce a quantity of a good more and more and more and not expect my cost to rise very quickly. Now, marginal cost is that metric that says that total cost, the change in total cost rather, is divided by the change in quantity. What this tells me is that as I produce that next product, how much is my total cost changing? Remember, you can think about marginal costs and marginal revenues and marginal utilities and whatever the marginal concept we're discussing. You can think about them in terms of that next incremental change. So how much does my total cost change as I produce that next product? And you cannot think about this without thinking about sort of the level of quantity that we're currently at. So we want to think about marginal cost as being, okay, let's say that I'm producing 10 units of my product and my costs are $100, and then I produce that 11th unit and my costs rise to 110. Well, this means that my marginal cost is $10 for that 11th product. So specifically, that 11th unit of my production cost me $10. It sent out $10 in the form of input cost, labor cost, capital cost, whatever. And then I go to produce that 12th unit, and let's say that my costs rise to 115. So my costs are still rising, but my marginal cost has actually fallen to 5 units. So that 12th unit has a lower marginal cost than the 11th unit. This is important for a firm to understand because we want to think about decision making as being on the margin. What that means is that decision making is made very incrementally. Do I want to produce my next unit? Well, I want to ask myself, how much money am I going to have coming in for that next unit versus how much money am I going to have going out for producing that additional unit? And only when those two things are maximized against each other, that is to say that when the profits that are coming in are maximized, will I choose to produce that additional unit. This is this sort of hyper rationality that we project onto competitive markets. Now, of course, we're living in a world that's a bit automaton here, meaning that we're assuming that essentially firms are perfect and make perfect decisions. In the real world, however, though, you can still imagine that it would be a unique and perhaps even successful attempt to find that profit maximizing quantity by just looking at your profits at different quantities and seeing at what point does a very high amount of quantity actually reduce my profits. And then that tells me how much I shouldn't produce. And then sort of as I go back, how little of my product produces a lower profit. And then that kind of gives me a range that I can choose from that I'm reasonably certain gets me close to profit maximization. So let's actually talk about that. All right, so let's remember that what we're describing here ultimately is the supply curve in the supply and demand framework, right? And so again, this graph is representative of many firms. Now we're thinking about things in terms of per firms, individual firms. But again, ultimately, all of the individual firm decisions will be aggregated up into the supply curve. Notice that as the price of the product rises, the willingness to supply the good rises, and we'll see why in just a moment. So obviously, if we're going to frame all of this around supply and demand, we have to go back to our competitive market assumptions. So recall that we assume that we have atomistic buyers and sellers. And essentially what this means is that there's so many buyers and so many sellers that no one buyer and no one seller can affect the market. We assume perfect information. That is to say that both consumers and producers have perfect information about what they're buying, what they're consuming, and ultimately that the transaction that occurred is mutually beneficial. We also assume in supply and demand somewhat rigidly that all products are identical. So if we're talking about the tomato market or the craft beer market, we're essentially assuming that they're all the same. Now, we have talked about in class how we can differentiate between low quality products on the low end of the supply curve and high quality products on the high end. And we can do this generally, but specifically when we talk about at equilibrium, given that equilibrium is at a particular price, our assumption is going to be that these 500 units at this particular price of excuse me are of a uniform quality. So because they're only at one portion of the supply curve, so ultimately the actual good itself is ultimately homogeneous. Um, and then lastly, we have free entry and exit. What this means is that firms can get in and out of the market essentially costlessly. This becomes really important. In fact, later on, we'll kind of think about this as in a sense, the oil in a competitive industry that keeps the system lubricated and keeps it moving and working efficiently. When we talked about these four competitive market assumptions earlier in the course, we framed them around ultimately the biggest assumption of the supply curve, and that is that producers are price takers. That is to say that producers don't set prices in competitive markets, that prices are set by the market and then firms respond to them. So this is a really important point. When you think about the decision of profit maximization for a firm in the competitive market framework, in this theory, we're assuming that prices are set by the market and then firms respond to those prices by selecting a profit maximizing quantity. This decision sort of ordering is very important because it ultimately goes on to explain some of the behavior that we assume will occur in competitive markets as we move from the short run to the long run. And so now is an important time to point out again that we're discussing the short run, and that later on we'll discuss what happens to competitive markets as we move into the long run if we assume all of this behavior that we're outlining here. So ultimately, we just talked about costs, and so ultimately, since profits are about revenues and costs, we of course need to talk about revenues as well. And so here we can see that total revenue again is just the amount of the product I sell times the price. And since the price is set by the market, we can go ahead and slap a star on there, and we can say that this is the amount of the product that I choose to sell times the market price, because we are going to assume that I'm a price taker and that I will simply take that price. Now, if we recall the definition of marginal revenue, again, that change in total revenue divided by a change in quantity, that incremental change in revenue when I sell an additional unit of my product. Let's think about this for a moment. Let's say that the current market price for a high quality tomato is $5.50. So right here at this equilibrium right here, $5.50. All right. Now, if I think about this and I assume that I always sell tomatoes for $5.50, and I ask myself, well, how much does my total revenue change when I sell my next tomato? The answer will always be, regardless of how many tomatoes I'm currently selling, will always be $5.50. If I always sell at the market price, then lo and behold, market price is my marginal revenue, which is, I think, a very sort of straightforward point, but it can be somewhat tricky sort of for the first time student. So it's important for us to establish very specifically that in perfectly competitive markets, the market price is always equal to a firm's marginal revenue. And again, ultimately, what we're going to do is we're going to use marginal revenue and marginal cost to make a profit maximizing decision. So let's see how that works.